Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Hirondelle Podcast. Today, I am here with. You want to introduce yourself?
Iris Peron-Ames.
Lorna, Elliott.
And Solomon Stone.
And I'm the host, Max Blakelock. Today, we'll be discussing. Okay. Today we will be discussing about the book called "The Color of Water" by James McBride. Would you like to give a quick summary, anyone?
So here at Hirondelle Books, we go for books that are very representative of like a sort of journey. They really demonstrate some growth and character development. As Hirondelle in French means swallow, and the swallow typically symbolizes a journey of sorts. It can also symbolize faith, which is a big theme in this book. And fun fact, Hirondelle is also the name of a vintage bike, which also connects to the book.
Yes.
So, The Color of Water by James McBride is a memoir. James McBride is James McBride is a biracial author, and he tells the story of his white Jewish mother, and through these pages also explores his own story and identity.
The layout of the book is very interesting. Every other chapter, it's in his perspective, and then in his mother's perspective. This was written or based off of an interview that he did on his mother and her life. And something that's really interesting about the every other chapter situation is there's a lot of parallels that go along with that. Small things such as like hot tea in a glass, like on page 9 and page 16, or like there's bigger things such as religion and like identity as well that go back and forth. And you can his mother's chapter usually starts the parallel. So like if there's a theme that you notice in her chapter, you can expect it to continue in his chapter like years later.
For instance, for example, there's two chapters that one follows, like two consecutive chapters. The first one in his mother's view is called School in
Yeah, and then
his is called School.
His is also called School, yeah. And there's even, and it's different for both of them. Even though the theme may be the same, it's very different for both of them, such as like Ruth, the mother, school wasn't a priority in her life. As for James, she really like told him like you have to do your school, like it's really, really important and all that. So yeah, the themes keep going. Also, the names of the chapters are pretty interesting too.
Yeah.
They're like, you want to say something about that?
No, I was just agreeing.
Oh yeah. They're just like random words, such as like chapter 3 was like kosher, which is a popular Jewish dish.
Chapter 14 was chicken man.
Yeah, chapter 14 was chicken man.
I feel like oftentimes they're like loosely related to the chapter that follows, but like it's never really like
the main idea. It's usually one, like for example, the kosher. Yeah.
Right.
For the kosher chapter, it was like her aunt's dish. Like it wasn't really something.
But it wasn't the main idea of the chapter, and I wonder why. Do you guys have any idea why James McBride might do that? Or?
I actually feel like the chapter names start to relate more and more to the overall theme and like content as you go on. So at first, it's just the bicycle, which is just a minor element of that chapter. But then as you go on, you get to Sam, which is a chapter about her brother Sam, or you have the next chapter, Brothers and Sisters, which once again is a parallel, which is about James's brothers and sisters. So it's, as you go on, it gets more specific, Eventually you get to chapters like Old Man Shilsky, which is literally just a chapter where he tries to, finds his grandfather and all that stuff.
Right, I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, and something pretty interesting too that I also noticed is the parallels in like the personalities. The personalities, similarities too, like when she gets claustrophobic when her uncle dies because she believes that... her grandfather dies because she believes that they buried him too soon, and that causes her to be claustrophobic on page 19. Oh, right. And then James is also claustrophobic from his siblings shoving him in a closet, so it was also like...
That's kind of funny.
Yeah.
it was also kind of like they were doing the interview, and then one person was like, "Oh, and I remember this," and then like it was kind of
it was a podcast.
And
yeah.
Yeah, and bringing it back to chapter 12, Daddy, it's...
sit down,
Can
bruh.
you pause it? Anyway, the chapter is all about James's dad and his story of how they didn't get married for a long time because of how people felt about it.
Yeah, and how... Yeah, go ahead.
And about his death and just his whole story with Ruth.
Yeah, and also how Ruth and him built the church, which is like still stands today.
Yeah,
That's crazy, dude.
Yeah, it's in Brooklyn, New York, and it's exactly how it was described in the book as just being like a really humble, like small cement building with a small cross on the front.
I think it's really cool when like you can like a lot of times like true stories or things that relate to real life when there's like evidence of the stuff in the book actually happening. And like I don't know, I just think that really adds to a
memoir,
book's narrative.
yeah.
Just like having something that's there and it's talked about in the book and it's really in real life.
Yeah,
You can
yeah.
look it up.
Yeah, like you were talking about in one of our previous meetings about the city, however you pronounce that.
Suffolk.
Yeah, Suffolk, and how it had like a really large population, which I found interesting because she didn't really stress that in her part of the story.
Right.
She was just kind of like, yeah, I lived in this city and I was bullied for being Jewish, and yes, that was interesting.
And also, going back to these ideas of parallels, I think that one element of the book that really illustrates these parallels is like through the themes. So, you have themes of family, religion, class, race, and like a major one is identity. They really figure out their identities through each other. Yeah, like, for example, on page 266, James even claims that, in order, he had to find out who he was, what his identity was, and in order to do that, he had to first find out who his mother was and explore her story.
And she was also struggling with identity too, I think.
Yeah.
When she was going through school, like, again, like I said, she was bullied for being Jewish, and she met her best friend. Do you remember her name? Like Caitlin or something.
Francis.
Oh, Francis, my bad, yeah. And you know what I also found pretty interesting? This is sort of off topic, but Ruth's name wasn't mentioned until like the end of the book.
Yeah.
Which I found really interesting.
What
Because
do you
like,
mean by that?
Well, we referred to her as Mommy for most of the book.
But I'm just saying, like, in the very beginning chapter, it introduces her
with her Jewish
with
name.
her Jewish name.
Yeah, but
Rochelle,
but
and
that it kind of, that in itself demonstrates like the development she's made, because her story is pretty much from going from her old life and her old identity as being part of a Jewish family to then her new self as Ruth, who's married to a black man, although he ends up dying.
Yeah.
Both of them end up dying with children and being Christian.
And
we can bring that right into the next. Or were you gonna say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna finish that. Finishing my thought, Ruth's name not being mentioned to the last chapters kind of like highlights that it was mostly about her story that was important, not like who she was.
Yeah.
Right.
And like, yeah,
It was like her journey.
yeah, like the name of our.
And that brings right into that brings right into our next topic, which is character development and how characters change over time of the story. And I would just want to point out Ruth and how much she changed. In the very beginning, she didn't mention her Jewish side. In fact, James didn't know that she was Jewish until I think chapter like 25 or something around there. And at the end, in the epilogue, when they go to the wedding, on page 282, Ruth says about the wedding, that's how the old Jews did it in my day too. You marry under the thing, the huppah, break the glass. That could have been me, and that just showed me. She just said that out of nowhere. No one brought that up into her, and brought the topic up. She just said that, and she would have never said that before.
Right.
And
Yeah.
she's so
Really
comfortable
powerful.
now.
And
Right.
also, that I also find it interesting that you chose. Sorry, were you gonna talk?
No.
No.
It was a big comment.
No, I know. Lorna made a face at me, so I responded.
Oh my god, you better cut this out, my guy.
No, keep this.
Okay.
It's a nice joke.
So anyway, I find it interesting that you chose that quote because that's then followed by James, who comments, "I know, and where would that have left me?" Which once again goes back to this idea that he found his own identity through looking for his mother's.
Yeah, and I feel like you said, character development is like really big with class, race, and religion, and like basically just their personalities in general. Like there were a lot of things that happened in Ruth's like childhood that really like brought her to her decision of, for example, when she ran away from home or when she got pregnant with Peter's child, and like it's just a lot of things kind of went into like who she was. And like James, being like a young man who didn't know anything about his mother, was always like, well, why are you like this? Mm-hmm. And it was just like the whole thing was just bringing it together and like where she was now. And
go ahead, Tom, when you have the second.
I also think that just like character development in general is pretty like. I feel like just because the book's on such a large time frame, like multiple years, and each chapter is
decades even.
Yeah, actually, and like each chapter is pretty short. Like a lot can happen in a very short amount of like words. So sometimes I felt like the characters felt like they were developing really quick, but then I was like, wait, this makes sense because it's happening over a really long, like.
Yeah, and every once in a while, like the book would just like throw in a date, and you're like,
exactly.
Wait a minute,
and
so
something will just happen, and it'll.
Yeah.
There's no build up because it happened.
Yeah, and it's like, and all of a sudden she was pregnant, and you're like, holy smokes!
Right.
Or like, right. And then all of a sudden he got accepted to college, and you like skipped all through his senior year, and you're like, because after what happened was Ruth sent her son James away because he was getting like in a lot of trouble at home, and he wasn't really doing his schoolwork, which she valued for him. Like she wanted him to like excel in, and so she sent him off to live with his older sister, and so that his older sister would straighten him out. And she actually did. When James came back, he was like, he really got back on his feet,
Got finished.
Yeah, and I was actually really surprised when it suddenly popped, like, and it was like, and he got accepted to a college, and I was like,
yeah, it's just like,
wow.
right.
Yeah, that's a really big turning point in James's life, because if Ruth had never done that, I don't think that James would be at where he is right now.
Right, where would he be? Would this book even exist?
He would still be, getting in trouble and not doing well in school.
Or maybe he would go back to just being like doing jazz and stuff.
Like you said, he'd be going back to being pregnant and also.
No, like maybe he would just become a jazz musician, and that's how he'd live his life.
Yeah, and didn't you say?
Which is a pretty good life.
And actually, if he did become a jazz musician, James McBride did outline what the life of a jazz musician would be like in his documentary series, The Process.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Okay. I kind of want to like talk a little bit. I kind of want to go back a little bit and talk more about the character development. I want to just like name some of the events that happened that really brought Ruth to make some of the decisions that she did, and some of like the parallels within that. Like take both of their mothers, for example. Like Ruth is the mother of James, and then Ruth's mother was a crippled woman who was like not appreciated by her husband.
Yeah.
And she
abused.
Yeah. Well, they both were.
Yeah.
And it kind of was interesting because they talk about being embarrassed about their mothers, which I found really interesting, because when Ruth, for example, when they were in the airport coming from Poland? Yes, Poland.
Yes.
Yep.
And they were going to Virginia.
Yep.
Ruth expresses being embarrassed about her mother, like secondhand embarrassment, like seeing her like all crippled and people like staring at them.
Right.
And James expresses like the same feeling like the next chapter.
Yeah.
Like I said, the parallels between the two chapters. About how he would always be embarrassed because he was embarrassed about his mother because she was a white woman in an all-black community, and she would sing like really terribly at church, and everyone would stare at them.
Her bike too, he like would talk about how he would try to avoid her and hide her from his friends when she would go out bike riding on her old vintagey bike, which, you know,
Connects
goes
to it.
back to our podcast.
Ooh,
Yes.
That kind of made me laugh. It was just like I don't know, it's just funny.
Yeah.
So yeah, does anybody else want to say anything? Solomon, you have anything to say?
About Lorna's point.
Yes.
I mean, yes. No, I don't have anything
Okay,
to say really.
so then-
you highlighted everything.
Okay, so
Good
then,
job.
moving on, you know, I also think the title's also, like, critically important to this book, you know, The Color of Water, which comes from the quote from page 51, like, James is struggling with his identity and his race a lot, so he asks his mother, is God black or white? And she says, God is the color of water. Water doesn't have a color. So this, you know, relates back to the themes of race and religion and identity and, you know,
All that. Basically the whole book. It just fit really well together.
yeah.
And it's a great quote too. It's one of my favorites from the book.
Yeah. Yeah. The quotes. The quotes that. You know what I found really interesting, especially on her chapters, because she was being interviewed while he was writing this book, or like the book was based off of the interview.
Basically.
Yeah, it basically was. But I found it really interesting when you could like tell the tone of her voice, like when she would get like super excited or super upset about something. Like even the most obvious part would like in the beginning of the very first chapter, it's called Dead, and she's like, "I'm dead. You want to talk about my family here, and I've been dead to them for 50 years. Leave me alone. Don't bother me. They want no parts of me, and I want no parts of them. Hurry up and get this interview over with." And it's just like, you can tell the tone of her voice. Like she's like kind of like, oh my God, are we really doing this right now?
Yeah.
That's just crazy to me because this whole book is one interview, and by the end of the interview, she's talking about her family.
Yeah,
Like James got that out of her.
Yeah.
And like I don't know, she was dead.
I mean, she's like she's open enough to like go and visit her old friend from back when she was younger in like Suffolk and all that stuff.
Yeah.
By the end of the book.
Definitely. I like you said, Max, it's really interesting to see like her come out of her shell by the end of the book and be like, well, she started the book talking really negative about them, and she ended it being like, well, they are what they are, and I am what I am.
That was the main point I wanted to bring up this whole time because it's just amazes me how James can get that out of her.
How powerful words can be, right?
Oh, yes.
Oh my
Tell
God.
us, Solomon.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah, I want that.
cheesy.
But like, yeah, I totally agree about like, you know, the tone, and I think that's a really great thing about his writing. You know, the tone's always very obvious, and you can kind of get like an immediate image of what Ruth is supposed to be like from her dialogue, from the way he describes her, you know, bow-legged and all that stuff. So yeah, I think he does a really good job of, you know, incorporating tone and like imagery and all this stuff, and he really gives us an idea of who she is, which makes her growth all the more incredible because then you know what she was like, and you know how her personality was shaped by, you know, her old life and all that stuff. And by the end of the book, you can see how her personality is still the same, but it's also a lot more open and stuff. So
Yeah, and yeah, definitely. The development of her character and accepting like Judaism again, which like not being part of it, but like accepting it as a thing again, was really interesting. And I think part of it, like why she couldn't ever go back, was well, as we know, midway through the book, we learned that she had run away with a black man, and her father was like appalled, and so she actually calls him up, and he tells her that her mother is seriously ill. So she rushes right back and like helps him out, and then she betrays her sister by leaving, and her sister kind of like, I don't know, expressed her betrayal to the rest of the family, and she just got kicked out. And so I feel like she felt like she was betrayed, even though she was the betrayer. Like, she felt like she was just cut out completely just for doing something that she thought was right.
Yeah.
So
She just felt like they didn't support her at all with her decisions. Like, hold up, pause it real. So yeah, as I was saying,
they didn't support her.
yeah, that's what I was saying.
She felt abandoned. Yeah.
Yeah, and as we get to the ending here, it just really amazed me how much James McBride really brought this story to life and used imagery and showed how much it was just. Oh yeah, and for one quote, I just want to read really quickly before we wrap this up. It was on page 279 when James is talking about David's mom and how she has to hide from the Nazis. The quote is, "Where she and 9 other Jews hid in a sewer for 14 months, living amidst rats and sewer filth in a wet underground prison, never seeing the sunlight fed by 3 Polish sewer workers." And that, he really just brought that into perspective, and he just showed you. It just, I could see that image in my mind when he.
Right.
But that's about his friend David's mother, who's
Right.
also
Yes.
Jewish.
Which is just another example of parallels in the story. We see that David's mother had a very similar story to his mother, and David had a very similar story to himself.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So they all kind of came together. Well,
I think that's a great.
no, wait. I have one more
She
parallel.
has one more thing.
I have one more parallel. Like, the parallels in the story are just like
It's crazy.
exact.
It's
just crazy. There's one in every
Right,
chapter.
right.
But this one I found like really tiny. I was looking back through my notes, and it was like written like really tiny on the side, and I was like, huh, interesting. And I like in my notes I was like, this is crazy. But anyway, it was a teeth parallel. In chapter 7 and 8, page 59 and 66. It says, "In those days, folks got infections and lost their teeth like it was lunch. In fact, my mother and father both had false teeth. My mother got them first, and then I don't know how to say father in Hebrew. And then he snuck off and get him a pair." That was page 59. And then on page 66, in the son's point of view, James's point of view, it says, "If you eat all that stuff, your teeth will drop out." And you wonder if maybe during the interview, like I said before, one memory linked to another.
Yeah.
And it was like, this is the reason why she was
And
always like...
That was how he came up with the idea of like structuring the book in the way that he did.
That's crazy, dude.
Yes. And it's perfect.
And yeah, perfect way to end it. Thank you for listening. So the podcast out.
Wait.
Oh, that was a good way to end it.
It didn't end though.
Oh,
All right,
podcast
bye.
out. I want to be the last word. Yes.